Now we're going to move to the next speaker. That's Mrs. Radka Janebová. She's also from the academic sphere. She works in the Institute of Social Work at the Philosophical Faculty, University of Hradec Králové. She works as a social worker for Selinger in Triangle, and she also moderates case conferences. She's going to present her speech of the issue of point 2.1.1 of the ethical code and her analysis of how clients can be unjustly blamed for their problems. So thank you very much. Mrs. Janebová, the floor is yours. Good morning. I would like to greet all the participants of this conference. To open with, I would like to mention that it is a very weird environment when I teach or lecture in teams. I'm used to being able to see their faces and non-verbal as well as verbal communication, or at least some gray windows, and in both cases I can see myself, but in this case all I can see is my PowerPoint presentation, which is very weird because I don't get any feedback. On the other hand, I feel great respect, solidarity. I have the feeling of belonging, that there are over 1,000 people joining this conference. It actually almost scared me, made me feel nervous, although I'm quite used to presenting to large audiences. My today's choice of the topic is maybe a little bit out of the overall concept of the conference. I don't want to talk about COVID, but as a topic I chose the topic of the client's responsibility. Maybe it's not the topic that's a hot topic of today, so I'm going to explain why soon, but I would like to talk about the ethical code of the social workers society, particularly the point which states that the social worker supports his or her clients towards awareness of their own responsibility. As a practitioner social worker, sometimes I have certain ambiguous feelings or ambiguity in my role, and this ambiguity is because I realize that I usually work with single mothers, how they are often unjustly blamed for not being responsible. And at the same time I realize what difficult conditions they have to live in. When I mention an example of my clients, single mothers, how they live in poverty, in an environment where they're being discriminated, social injustice. So I tend to see them as a victim of social environment, circumstances, and my ambiguity has a second part. Because in practical work, I also come across moments when I myself self-reflect my feeling of upset towards the client. And it does cross my mind that they are irresponsible. For example, they don't come to meetings that we agreed on, that they don't do the tasks that we planned. that they spent more money than we agreed, etc. And I tend to think a lot how to work with this ambiguity. That was a motivation for this contribution, because at the beginning the Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs contacted me with an offer to present at this conference. And the topic was supposed to have been related to COVID or to ethics of social work. And the topic of responsibility is very strongly related to ethics. But when we talk about responsibility in connection to ethics, we usually talk about responsibility of social workers, but I would like to talk about the responsibility or irresponsibility of our clients. That might be quite a hot topic for many of us. That's why the objective of my contribution is to discuss the risks of social workers' focus on individual responsibility of clients, and at the same time I would like to propose an alternative approach towards responsibility using inspiration from Iris Marion Young in her book Responsibility for Justice. When I was thinking about the topic of responsibility, I looked into the codes of ethics. I admit that for some time I was a little bit confused which code to follow, because on one hand we have a code of ethics from 2006 by the Social Workers Society, but then we also have a code of ethics of a social worker of the Czech Republic that was created by the Professional Association of Social Workers in Social Services. I wasn't quite sure which code applies to me, which one to follow, which one is the current one, the up-to-date one. And I was also confused that in the second code they said that both the social workers as well as the professional chamber of social workers follow it, but on their respective website I found a reference to the first code. So I honestly, openly admit that I wasn't too sure which one to follow, so I found inspiration in both. The first one says that social worker supports his or her clients towards the awareness of own responsibility, and in the second one we find 3 times the mention of responsibility, that we should support own responsibility with regards to their own capabilities, abilities and skills, and then again in another point that we should support clients towards the awareness of one's own responsibility, and then there is another mention of it. So that we should direct our clients towards their own responsibility, it seems to be a very important topic, even in the codes, and it is also important in our practice as social workers, as whether we like it or not, we always have to ask ourselves about the responsibility of clients, such as moral responsibility for the situation they are in, and how we assess their responsibility that influences the intervention plan. Linda Sokachová already spoke about it when she spoke about the dilemma between judgment and solutions. I think that most of us sometimes comes across, or ideas come to their minds that their clients are lazy, they don't know, that they're not good with money, they're aggressive, they smoke, they don't look after their health, they don't look after their children properly, and this brings us to an idea that they are irresponsible, that somehow they're failing, and we might be at risk by labeling these clients as non-deserving, and that we are going to work with them on an individual basis and work with them on mobilizing their own responsibility, and we might also assert control or even sanctions towards such clients. And here I would like to compare two approaches how to approach responsibility or irresponsibility of clients. One of these perspectives, I labeled it as individualistic perspective, supports the approach of mobilizing clients towards their individual responsibility. The second approach I called a critical perspective, and it's more about the collective common responsibility. So first I'm going to introduce the first one, the individualistic one, and that's about values. Let's dominates or prevails in the current society, and maybe, although maybe the COVID era is in favor of moving away from this perspective. So that's why I said at the beginning that my contribution might not be that up to date. So again, this things are changing dramatically. So the individualistic perspective assumes that people are certain business entities that are supposed to compete over resources. As Jan Keller often points out, that we're like kind of businesses competed with one another. That's a notion of homo economicus, where our businesses, our clients and ourselves, that we are competing. And it assumes that the environment is fair and just, and we all have equal opportunities. And if somebody fails in such environment, the blame is on individual failure of a human, sometimes even irresponsibility. And of course, once you perceive somebody as failing and irresponsible, it's often connected with the idea that people who are irresponsible don't have a moral right to expect help from others, from the society. Or that what is expected from them is that they should try harder themselves and they should mobilize their own individual responsibility. We too can do this. That's why if we base it on that we all are responsible for ourselves individually, that if we have some issues, we should deal with it ourselves. Such values lead us to working with the client in a way that where we mobilize their individual responsibility. Such approach, however, brings about certain risks which might be in dispute with social work values, at least with values that are enforced by the International Association of Social Workers. One risk of this approach is the tendency to depolitize social issues. In other words, although many issues of our clients is outside of their control, on a level of micro, meso, or macro system. We only work with these clients through individual case work. Many issues can occur on micro level, on the level of family, friends of our clients, on the level of certain organization, institutions that our clients function within, or on a macro level that can be a wrong social policy, bad legislation, discrimination in society. As an example of my single mother client, a big issue on the macro level is the lack of value for the single mothers, and being blamed that their own situation is their own fault. And the minute when we overlook the causes of these issues that are outside our client's control, what we're doing is we're unpolitizing the issues. Social work is a political work in a way, and it should be applied also in the mainstream social work. Another risk of this individual approach is that when we believe that people are responsible for their own issues and therefore they should deal with it themselves and they shouldn't expect help from society, it makes us to resign to initiate any changes, any transformation in social work. We stop influencing our environment again on the micro, meso, or macro system. The third risk of this individual approach is that we move away from complexity of the complex approach, comprehensive approach towards social work. If we perceive issues as individually caused, there is a risk that we might focus just on this one single individual barrier on the side of the client, that's his or her irresponsibility, and we're not going to pay attention to the other issues, reasons for the issues, whether they're barriers on the side of the individual. It could be mental issues, incompetencies, some handicaps, disabilities, and also barriers that are on the side of the social environment or in the interaction between the client and the environment. Another risk, this overemphasizing the individual approach, is applying more repressive ways of control. If we assume that the client is responsible for his or her situation, it may lead us to us providing well-meant advice to find cheaper housing, to find a job, to try a bit harder, to spend less money. And because our clients are not always able to put these things into practice, these pieces of advice, it may happen that when they do not follow them, do not do it, we start perceiving them even more as irresponsible, and we become more repressive without realizing that some of these pieces of advice cannot be implemented under their social circumstances. It can also lead us to distinguishing our clients to responsible and irresponsible, but it's important to realize that life is much more complicated than it's not binary. All of us is at times irresponsible, and to label somebody as purely irresponsible goes against the values of social work. I don't want to say that people should not be responsible at all. Absolutely not. I think that we all should have some responsibility, including our clients, for cause and the impact, action and reaction. What I'm trying to say is that there is a shift of responsibility being moved from a collective or community towards an individual. That's why I would like to offer an alternative point of view, which I called as a critical approach or critical perspective. It refuses that it's always the responsibility of the individual. The causes of social issues are the result of interaction between a human and social structures in which that human lives. So what that means is that even though people may behave irresponsibly, we don't need to see them as the only cause, but it might be a reaction to certain impulses from their environment. It doesn't always have to be just the family, as we sometimes like to simplify it, but it can be also on the level of meso and macro system. I'm going to give you an example of my client who was dealing drugs. That seemingly can be a very irresponsible decision. But when we take a closer look at her situation, dealing of drugs was taking place last year between February and April. It was at the time of when the COVID crisis started. At that point, my client did not receive her housing benefits for 2 months. Her rent was 14,000 and her benefits were about 11.5, so she would need extra 2,500 crowns to cover her housing and then of course some money for food, etc. What were her options? She could go to work, but with take a job. But with two little kids, one of them being on the autistic spectrum, she couldn't find a job. Many people were being laid out at that point. She could go to asylum shelter housing, but it takes 2 months before you can get in. Third option is that under such circumstances you should not need to pay the rent, but her rentman basically told her that that's not an issue. So another option was prostitution. She did not have the stomach for it. Stealing, she did not want to steal. And the third option was to deal drugs, that she had a little bit of experience. So now, if we look at it, was her behaving actually irresponsibility? What I'm trying to say is that this irresponsibility can be initiated by social structures. And when we consider the irresponsibility of our clients, we need to take into account that they're on different social positions than we are. They have different resources. We, from the middle class, offer them solutions that seem to be realistic to us, but they're not realistic for our clients. And that exactly applies on this case. Whereas for us, what would be applicable as many other options how to deal with these situations, this client had much less of these actual situations. If we call somebody irresponsible, there needs to be a freedom to act, but her freedom to act was only choosing from 3 very bad options. if we're asking for responsibility, such a client needs to be able to take control, and that's also derived from a mental capacity. If you're under stress, you don't always have the competency to make good decisions. According to some results, when under stress, your IQ drops down by 13 points. So, of course, it lowers down your capacity to make good decisions. To conclude, I would like to say that we should be very careful when we label or start labeling our clients as irresponsible. So how to work with responsibility or irresponsibility of clients, very briefly. We should really research the irresponsibility with regards to social structures, not to blame them for being irresponsible when the issues are much more complicated. We should perceive responsibility as the responsibility of us all, not to see just as a responsibility of the client, but to ask questions about our own responsibility. For example, how do I myself participate in unjust functioning of the society, at least towards Iris Marion Young? We should more think about the future, not the past, but how can we change in cooperation with clients, NGOs, church organizations, Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, community, how all of us together, how we can contribute towards decreasing social inequality in society, and we should together participate in collective actions through which we can start remedying or initiate remedy of these unjust structural processes. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for your contribution, for this reflection of responsibility or irresponsibility, and the particular example, which are single mothers. As we know that in times without COVID, there are many labels for these women in the public arena. So I think that's a great topic to contemplate. Do we have any questions? There is thanks for very, very fruitful presentation. And there is a question: how do we work with the topic of ethics at Czech universities? Do we have an overview, not just from Hradec Králové, which is your alma mater, but something that maybe you can see as a challenge for the future, not only related to the pandemics? Well, that's kind of difficult to reflect on. But of course, on higher vocational schools and universities, we have a subject called Ethics of Social Work, so all the students learn about essential ethical codes. So it does exist, and it is happening, but if I was to answer how to teach ethics in the future, I think the speaker before me, Mr. Peter Brnula, said it very well. Perhaps we should reflect how the social work affects the feeling in society. I'm very, very careful about neoliberalism. Let's not live under the illusion. Maybe now we are a profession that's valued. I'm more pessimistic for the future. I'm a little bit concerned that once the COVID pandemic is over, social work is going to again be marginalized, and especially the resources that flow our way are going to be decreased. So maybe we should reflect on how these cuts are going to affect the application of social work values in practice. That's what we should be very, very concerned about, very sensitive about. So thank you very much for your answer and for your whole presentation.